And so I was like cycling across the railway track, and as I did that, like a gust of wind came, basically blew me and the bike into like the inlet, like the hole in between the rubber. And because that happened and the wind was so fast, the whole bike just fell on the ground. Picked up the bike, tried to move the bike like onto the side of the road, and I couldn't move the bike. And I was like, "Oh, why is the bike not moving?" And then I looked down at the wheel, and the whole wheel had folded in half. And I was like, "Geez, man, like, what do I do?" Like, there's no way I can continue to cycle. I'm in the middle of the desert in Kazakhstan. What do I do? The Pamir Highway was definitely one of the highlights of the trip. It's a pretty incredible place. It's like, at that point, it was like, I think the remotest place I've had ever been. And yeah, it's just wild.
Welcome to the Seek Travel Ride podcast, where we share the stories and experiences of people who have undertaken amazing adventures by bike. Whether it's crossing state borders, mountain ranges, countries or continents, we want to share that spirit of adventuring on two wheels with our listeners. Hello, I'm your host, Bella Malloy, and I'm happy to introduce our guest for today's episode of the Seek Travel Ride podcast, Ed Hawes. It was with a yearning for adventure that Ed dreamed up a challenge that would be overwhelming for many. What was this challenge, you ask? A long-distance bicycle tour. But this tour isn't something that would just take a matter of weeks to complete. It would be one which would take him to the other side of the world, literally. Cycling from the UK all the way to New Zealand. In fact, Ed is nearing the end of this trip right now, and I'm thrilled to be speaking with him today. Ed, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you for having me. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm really excited to be speaking with you, Ed, and learning more about this adventure of yours. A question I always like to open up the podcast with, though, for all my guests is, can you describe the very first bike you ever rode?
Very first bike I ever rode. But it was like a mountain bike, I think. Like, it was like a big mountain bike, a yellow thing. I can't even remember what the brand was. Yeah. But I probably rode that, I don't know, maybe when I was 10 or something, 10 or 11 in the countryside. I grew up in like a little village in the UK, and yeah, I used to do a bit of mountain bike. But yeah, I can't remember what it was, what make it was, or anything about it.
And like most 10-year-olds, did you find you rode that bike after school, you'd jump on the bike, go away adventuring, or is it something you did for a little bit, or did you ride for all your childhood?
Yeah, I think I just did it with mates, just getting around the village. And then there used to be like a forest behind where I grew up. So yeah, just used to ride around there with some mates. But it was nothing big. Yeah, it was just getting around and having fun with friends, I guess.
Bike's often a tool for fun, I always think. Don't get me wrong, you can have moments on a bike, but overwhelmingly for me, if I think of my bike rides, I think of fun.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. It's all about having fun.
As I mentioned, you're currently on a trip all the way from the UK down to New Zealand, and we're speaking to you from your hotel room in Adelaide at the moment.
Yep.
I'm looking forward to delving into your trip, and I guess also finding out what you think of my home country, Australia. But before we get into the detail of that, could you briefly just introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, so I'm Ed, originally from the UK. Grew up in a village about 60 or 100 kilometers south of London. I've been living in London for maybe the past 8 or 9 years. And yeah, in April last year, I decided that I'd get on my bike and cycle from London to New Zealand. So yeah, here I am.
I know we're going to get up to the decision of deciding to go on a trip so long and so far. But have you always been passionate about the outdoors? Would you describe yourself as a person that would prefer to take a weekend out in the countryside rather than going to the city lights?
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, for me, like, I love the city. I love being in London. I love being in like the hustle and bustle of people. I love having everything on your doorstep. But yeah, there's also that other side of me which like loves being outside, loves the adventure, loves climbing mountains, going for hikes, going for long rides, and yeah, just in the outside really. But I guess that's something that came a bit later in life, maybe like in my early 20s, I'd say. So it hasn't always been there.
You said there that the yearning for the outdoors, you felt more the pull from probably around your early 20s. You were in Canada on a trip around that time, weren't you?
Yeah, so my brother lives in Vancouver, so I went on a trip to Vancouver to see him. And Vancouver is like a city that is surrounded by mountains, surrounded by the outdoors. You got like 3 ski resorts within like a 30-minute drive. You got Whistler, maybe 2 hour drive from Vancouver, and then you've got tons of national parks and stuff like that, all within like a really close proximity. So yeah, I was over there for like 2 weeks, and we basically did like, my brother's like quite, I guess, outdoorsy, quite adventurous. He does that for work. So we went on like a few different trips whilst I was in Vancouver, and one of them being we went over to, I think it's called Vancouver Island. We went to Vancouver Island, went to the Pacific Rim National Park, and we just went and did a bit of mountain climbing here and there, and yeah, I basically loved it. And I think that's probably when I fell, like, I always liked the outdoors, but I think that's probably when I fell in love with adventure. Yeah, I was just basically speaking to him, and I was like, oh, how can I need something more out of my life, and how can I do that whilst living in London? And I think that's when he said, oh, you need to like challenge yourself. You need to give yourself a challenge, push yourself. So why don't you do that like physically through adventure? And then that's when Land's End to John O'Groats came up. So we planned out doing Land's End to John O'Groats, which is like cycling the length of the UK.
And at this point in time, so I'm just thinking, were you much of a bike rider then? Was cycling part of your life?
No, it wasn't at all. So that part of my life, so I was living in London, earning hardly any money. I couldn't even afford to get the tube to work, really. I'm struggling to get to work, to pay for the tube. So why don't I use the cycle to work scheme that I had with work, which is basically where you can get a bike tax-free through work, like a new bicycle. So it's like, yeah, why don't I invest in this bicycle through work, and then I can commute to work every day, which was like a 7 mile commute. And that means that I get to save money on the tube. Don't have to worry about whether I can get in or out of, like, afford to go to work or not. Yeah, so I wasn't a cyclist at all. I just used to, from then onwards, I would just cycle to and from work during my commute.
So you went from a 7 mile commute to the idea that the challenge you'd set for yourself would be from crossing the country, Land's End to John O'Groats. Did you go south to north then? That's Land's End's in the south, and John O'Groats is up north in Scotland, isn't it?
Yeah, so Land's End is like, it's in Cornwall, yeah. So it's like the most southerly point of the UK in the southwest of England. So from there all the way up through the middle of the country up to Scotland to John O'Groats, which is the highest point on mainland UK.
That's quite an undertaking, especially coming from a commute of 7 miles. Was it 7 miles each way or 7 miles there and back?
Yeah, it was 7 miles each way. So I was living I think I was living in Stratford at the time, which is like East London. My office was in central London. Yeah, so it was 7 miles each way. But it was all like down like, canal paths and stuff. So, and like cycle paths. So it was all very safe and easy. So yeah, I guess going from that to Land's End to Groats is like quite a big undertaking.
Once you put the idea out there into the world, and it's more than an idea in your head and you tell others about it, sort of a sense of commitment then, isn't there?
Yeah, so if you tell people about it, then yeah, you kind of, you're under pressure to then do it. Because if you don't do it, then you've got to speak to your friends and be like, oh no, I'm not going to do this anymore. You're forcing yourself into a situation where you have to go through with something.
I'm interested then, Ed, 7 miles each way. So 14 miles, I'd say that's probably around 25 kilometres maybe a day, which,
yeah, it is.
5 days a week's actually, we would call them junk miles. Like, it's fairly good constant training in the legs. How did you prep for Land's End to John O'Groats? Did you go in there just from commuting 7 miles a day, or did you start doing longer training rides?
Yeah, I basically did loads of research. Went onto every single Land's End to John O'Groats blog, went on to all these cycling forums to figure out like how you do something like that, how you train for it or whatever. This was a long time ago, but I think I did quite a few training rides because I was really nervous about doing it, and I was convinced that I wasn't physically capable of doing it at all. So I probably over prepared and overtrained. So yeah, I think I went on this like training program where it's like you increase the amount of mileage or kilometers you do per week. So you do like 2 short rides and then 1 long ride at the weekend. And then every week those distances increase. So I think by the time I was doing Land's End to John O'Groats, I think I had done one 100-mile ride before that. So I think that was my longest distance. Or was it? Maybe it wasn't 100 miles. Maybe it was like 80. But it was like it was quite long. So that's like 140 kilometers or something.
Even 80 miles is a big ride,
Yeah.
especially coming from 7 miles each way to work.
I gave myself quite a long time to train for it. I think that trip in Canada happened in Feb. I went and did Lands End to John O'Groats in September or end of August. So it was quite long.
Well, it's interesting because you say it's quite long, but if you think of it, it's what, 6 months? 6 months to turn a 14 mile a day bike commute into. How many days did it take to do Land's End to John O'Groats?
I think I did it in 12 days or 11 days. But I wanted to do it quicker. And it can definitely be done quicker than that.
There's an argument both for and against quicker, isn't there? Because I guess it depends what the motivations for the goal are. One is absolutely emptying yourself, pushing yourself to the absolute limit, and I can see where quicker, faster, stronger, that sort of stuff comes into it. But then there's also the other part of it, which is actually being energetic enough each day to sort of be appreciative of where you are and what you're doing as well, which I think, in my experience, going quicker, it's just a total different mindset, if that makes sense. Like, you go into an absolute other world.
Yeah, 100%.
And that route, I know that England's not necessarily known for having the highest mountains in the world, but that route, I imagine, takes you over quite some hilly terrain too, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Like, I think the southwest of the UK is quite hilly, like Cornwall and Devon, but it's like rolling hills. But then by the time you get up to like the Peak District or the Yorkshire Dales, that becomes fairly hilly, like maybe, I don't know, 500 to 800 meter peaks.
And really steep too.
Yeah, and really steep. So I think when I did Lands End to John O'Groats, I went over the highest peak in the Peak District and then the highest peak in the Yorkshire Dales, which people do Lands End to John O'Groats. They don't normally do that because it's not the fastest route through the UK. So I kind of like, because my uncle lives like in between the Yorkshire Dales and the Peak District, and he wanted to do half of the trip with me. So I basically detoured towards him and picked him up after 6 days of riding solo. And then there's a village called Hawes. So my surname is Hawes. So I wanted to go to that village. So then that village was like on the other side of the highest peak in the Yorkshire Dales.
Please tell me you took a photo of yourself in front of the Hawes sign.
I did, of course. But yeah, so that was kind of cool. But also, yeah, I think like the most elevation I did in one day on that trip was 10,000 feet, which I don't know what that is in meters, but it's quite a lot.
Yeah, it's about 3,300, 3,400 meters. So that's something to be proud of. I always say if you're going for a 100-kilometer ride and you rack up 1,000 meters of elevation, it's been a fairly hilly ride. And you can definitely get rides that will get a lot more elevation than that in that time, in which case you've probably climbed a mountain or two. I think, Ed, don't sell yourself short. You didn't take the shortest way, but you may have taken the hardest way.
Yeah, possibly. And the most scenic way, I reckon. Peak District, Yorkshire Dales, beautiful place.
Especially at that time of the year too, I think.
Yeah, I mean, so I did that in, August, September. Yeah, I remember I started and it was 26 degrees, which is like in the UK, that's an incredible summer. Like very, very hot, like lovely weather. So yeah, it started 26 degrees, was very, very happy. Had sun all the way through England. And then as soon as I crossed the Scottish border, it just rained, like monsoon type of rain every single day. And then by the time I got to John O'Groats, it was 9 degrees. So yeah, it's kind of like you get everything.
You signed up for a challenge and it sounded like it delivered on its promise.
Yeah, for sure, definitely. I think if anyone's going to do or interested in bike touring, I think like anyone from the UK especially, I think doing Land's End to John O'Groats is like a really good tester. It's a really good like introductory ride that you can do because you get everything. And also it's like fairly easy because it's in the UK and there's convenience and stuff, so.
Yeah, and I guess if you're from the UK, you speak the language already, you know where to get food and water and how things work and the system works. You don't have the culture shock that comes, which I'm sure we're going to get into a bit with your story. So Ed, you conceived this challenge on a whim after being inspired by a trip to visit your brother in Vancouver. You complete the jog, Land's End to John O'Groats. And then how did this one come up? How did, UK to New Zealand get manifested in your mind?
Well, the UK to New Zealand, or like round the world, has been in my mind since I was basically like 18. So I guess Land's End to John O'Groats was kind of like reigniting that sense of adventure or that fire for this trip that I'd kind of like forgotten about over time. I went backpacking when I was 18. I was obsessed with travel and like traveling around the world. So I went backpacking, did this like quick trip, and it was just like, your bog standard backpacking trip where you go to various countries and you basically get pissed the whole time, and you have a great time when you're 18. And then I got back from that trip and I was kind of like depressed. So I started like obsessing over kind of like travel literature and reading up on other people that had done traveling stuff. And I was kind of like, yeah, you can go backpacking, but backpacking is kind of done that. And adventure travel I started reading more about adventure travel basically because it kind of seemed more interesting. I read books about other people that had cycled around the world. The main book was probably Alistair Humphreys. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Yeah, he's all about micro adventures and stuff too, isn't he?
Yeah. So when he was like 22, he did a around the world trip that took him 4 years, and he's released two books about it. And like, so I read those books, and it was the first time I'd ever heard about using a bike as a means to travel. And it just basically opened my eyes up to that kind of traveling, and I was like, oh, it sounds amazing. It sounds like a much better way to travel than to backpack or to fly or whatever. And I was like, yeah, that sounds cool. So that's something that I want to do. So from the age of 18, I was like my dream is to travel around the world by bike. But I think first of all, I need to go to university, get a job, move to London, get a bit of a career under my belt, save some money, whatever, and then I'll go in a few years. So yeah, it's always been there, and I'm now 31. So I kind of moved to I did everything: university, moved to London, get a job. And then I guess like and life just gets in the way, I guess. And over time, like London has everything you could want. It's very, very comfortable. It's very fast paced. There's lots of things to do and see. So yeah, I guess the years just ticked by. And yeah, that sense of cycling or traveling or whatever kind of faded. And then I went to go see my brother in Vancouver, and then he was like, "Ed, you need to do that cycling trip you've always dreamt about. Why don't you do Land's End to John O'Groats?" And so yeah, here we are.
So you do Land's End to John O'Groats, and then does that then give you maybe the kickstart and confidence to follow up on that thought bubble that you had when you were 18 to go around the world?
Well, yeah, because I think cycling around the world is like quite a big, like as an 18-year-old, it's quite a big thing. It's quite daunting. It's quite scary, right? Yeah. So when I did Land's End to John O'Groats, you have all those same feelings. It's like, oh, I'm not a cyclist. I can't cycle 11, 12 days back to back with all my luggage on the bike. I can't do that. And then when you do that, and you can do it, and you're like, actually, that wasn't that difficult. Yeah, you have like a few long days on the bike, but I got from A to B. I cycled the length of the UK, and I've never really cycled before. Like, that's amazing. And then, so yeah, from then onwards, I was like, I have to go through with this dream to cycle around the world. And also, I just remembered, like, I bought that bike for Land's End to John O'Groats, and it's the same bike I've got now. But I bought it thinking, I'm going to cycle around the world with this bike.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
It's serving its purpose.
Yeah, exactly.
What sort of bike is it?
It is a Trek Crossrip 2, and it's like a light tourer. They call it a light tourer, or that's what it said in the product description when I bought it like 7 years ago. So yeah, it's a good bike, but I mean, if I was to do it again, I would go with a different bike. I've had quite a few issues.
Yeah, you've had a few mechanicals on this trip of yours, haven't you?
I've had so many mechanicals. It's like the bike is set up for light touring. So I mean, I should have read that product description and took that as a warning. I mean, it's not set up for like long distance proper bike touring, I don't think. So it's got like an aluminium frame, carbon forks, so it's not your traditional steel frame Surly or anything like that.
Might be well at home on the canal paths getting to work to and from in London.
Exactly.
The Silk Road, Pamir Highway, Karakoram Highway, Nullarbor Plain. Here you come.
I mean, I left on 28s, so like 28 millimeter tires.
Yeah, 28 tires, yes. Which, for those of our listeners who maybe aren't as well versed in bike technology, when you see someone on a racing or a road bike with drop handlebars, 28s is now the sort of tyre width that you would see on modern road bikes now, I guess. So they used to be skinnier, but 28s, I would question, Ed, how many people would cycle around the world on 28? I'm sort of thinking Schwab Marathon 42, 45 mils. Wow.
I mean, yeah, well, I've swapped them. They're now 32s, but still. And they are Schwab Marathon Plus. But yeah. Maybe that was just my naivety at the beginning of knowing what I was going into. Yeah. But I wanted to do it quick, so
And the motivation to do it quick, was it similar to Land's End John O'Groats? You wanted to do it quicker, like, or is it just the world that we live in? Like, being able to take time away to do something like this isn't necessarily easy.
yeah, I mean, it's a mixture because, like, now I really like cycling. I really like after Land's End to Johnny Groats, I came back from that trip and I cycled loads, did a lot of road cycling and stuff, and so I really enjoy it. So I went into this trip kind of absolutely loving being there to just cycle and love cycling long distances, quite a fast pace. And then there's also the other side, which is like I'm there using the bike as a means to travel, and so I need to stop and look at things. And yeah. So basically, I said to work, like, here's my resignation. I'm going to do this trip. And they said, this is awesome. How long do you think it will take you? And like out of nowhere, I was like, oh, I don't know, a year. It will take me 1 year to do. And they were like, Ed, we don't want to lose you. Will you take a sabbatical for 1 year? So I was like, oh, yeah, of course. Not many companies do that, I don't think. I think that's quite a rare thing to do. And it means I've got my job security, it means I can go back and I can start paying off all of my debts from this trip straight away. So yeah, so from day one, I was like, okay, I've got 1 year to do this trip. And I've got quite a lot of like mileage to cover in that 1 year. So yeah, I kind of wanted to do it fairly fast, but other people who are touring at the moment who do it way faster than me.
Yeah, although conversely, other people who would do it over a number of years as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
I recently interviewed a guest of the podcast, Mark Gresser, and he left from his driveway in Perth, ended up in Paris over a period of 2.5 years, So
Yeah.
29,000 kilometres and a lot of different memories, a different style of touring, but I'm sure for certain you were going in the opposite direction totally, but I know you crossed very similar paths.
Yeah, probably.
Let's dig into route planning there a little bit then, Ed, because, okay, you've got this deadline of a year.
Yeah.
You've said to yourself, I'm going from my home in the UK, I'm going to go all the way to the other side of the world in New Zealand. How do you devise where you're going to go? How did you devise the route?
I've done quite a lot of research about like other people that have done this. So I think the route that I've done is like quite a well-trodden cycling route. And so like one of the areas that I really wanted to go to was the Pamir Highway in Tajikistan in Central Asia. So that was like one of the highlights for me. I also wanted to go to Pakistan because that's where my grandfather was born. So I wanted to kind of like retrace my like family history through Pakistan. And India, I've always been interested in India and I've never been to India. So I was like, I need to go to those places. And then yeah, it just makes sense to go from India through to Myanmar, then Southeast Asia down to Singapore, and then, so from Singapore, I originally wanted to go to Indonesia and cycle across the equator and go all the way down as far as I could get to Australia, and then obviously New Zealand. So I guess if you got those three, like, so you got the Pamir Highway, you got Pakistan because of family, and then you've got India just because of like general interest. It kind of like the rest of the route is kind of obvious. You've got Europe, and then you've got like, Turkey, obviously, then Georgia, and so it kind of all fits into place. But yeah, in terms of like route planning and stuff, like day to day, like I was like quite obsessed with the route to begin with. I think I planned like the first 25 days on Strava because I was like, oh, I want to get to this place by this point. So I need to do this amount of mileage per day. So yeah, I started off like planning all the different routes. And it was like mostly like, I think through Europe, because I wanted to get through Europe quite quick because I knew that Europe was going to be expensive and my daily budget was only about £10 a day. Okay, I need to do Europe quick, get into Turkey, and then yeah, it's going to be a lot cheaper, so I can kind of take more of my time. So I basically planned out all of Europe before I left the UK, and it was basically the quickest and flattest route, I think.
You weren't going over the Alps? Thinking you have to cross a mountain range somewhere, surely, don't you?
I did go over the Alps, yeah.
Whereabouts did you cross the Alps?
I can't even remember. I left Salzburg and went up, and then
So Austria.
yeah, and then down into Villach in Austria. So
into Italy.
yeah, no, Villach is it's close to Italy, but it's still Austria. It's like the south of Austria. So I did a route through there, up and down through there, but it wasn't that bad. Like it wasn't that high.
Did you enjoy the mountains?
Did I enjoy them? Yeah. I mean, I enjoy cycling mountains and doing climbs and stuff, but I didn't actually enjoy the Alps that much, to be honest. I found it very, very overpopulated. I don't know. I was like, there's so many mountains, but there are so many cars. The mountains, in my mind, should be like very quiet and beautiful places that should just be left for hiking and stuff. And in the Alps, you just got motorways, tunnels.
Car exhaust fumes.
Yeah.
That resonates so much with me because I live in the French Pyrenees, and it's always something that strikes me about the main difference between the Pyrenees and the Alps. And the peaks in the Pyrenees, I mean, we have some very high peaks, not quite as high as the Alps, but there's just that. And it's not that there's not touristy areas in the Pyrenees, but it's just not quite as commercial.
Yeah.
So when you're cycling, you're not on big roads. There's not often large trucks. You're not breathing in the exhaust fumes. It's just still got that rustic, familial, rural feel about it. It's hard to describe until you've been here. I don't know if you've been to the Pyrenees before, but
no, I haven't. I would love to go.
Well, if you do, have to come and see me.
Yeah, I'll hit you up.
We'll talk more about your adventure for sure. So that first leg through Europe then, like you said, with a mind on budget, it was sort of traversing it a bit quick. But I imagine you're crossing countries quite rapidly too. And is that the first time in your trip where travelling in this style, coming across countries and cultures differently sort of hits you a bit as well?
Yeah, I think so. Because it's like, I mean, you kind of look at, it made me look at Europe a little bit differently. Because like before, when you go on holiday, you just go to one country in Europe, spend a couple of days there, and then you fly home. Whereas when you cycle through all these like different countries, go from one culture to another, and you only spend like 1 day, 2 days, maybe 3 days in each country. Yeah, it's really, really interesting. It like makes you think differently about Europe and about the world and about land borders and about culture. Because it's like, how can all these countries are quite small? So like, how can there be a completely different language and a completely different culture, like in such a small space? And there's like 5 or 6 other languages and cultures all around this one culture, if you know what I mean. There's like loads of different countries. It's fascinating. I remember actually when I was stopped at this petrol station just to have a coffee outside. I think I don't even know where, like either the Netherlands or somewhere, or Belgium or Germany. And the guy said to me behind the petrol station, he was like, "Oh, do you want me to speak to you in English, Dutch, German, or Flemish?" And I was like, "What?" Like the fact that you know like 4 or 5 languages and you can speak fluently like that is crazy to me. And you just work at a petrol station, like that's such an incredible skill to have. But it's like normal in like mainland Europe, I guess.
You're not wrong. And actually, I mean, grammatically as well, I often think that people who have learned English from some of these European nations know English grammar better than, some of the English speaking countries do.
Definitely.
Actually, speaking about languages, how did you get on then with the language barrier? Like, other than the universal body language hand sign gestures, how did you find coming across different languages?
In Europe, it was kind of fine because most people speak English. But yeah, I would use Google Translate a lot, which I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing because it makes you very lazy. It means that like when you're sitting at a restaurant and you don't know what is written on the menu, you just get Google Translate out and you can just open your camera and it translates in real time, and then you just point at what you want. But yeah, like speaking and stuff, yeah. I mean, I would always learn the basics like hello, thank you, goodbye, and then like sometimes like what the word bread is, but I mean, to be honest, I did use Google Translate a lot, so that kind of instantly breaks down barriers in terms of language. Yeah, I didn't really have that many issues, I don't think, or I didn't find it that difficult to communicate with people at all.
Did you also find as you got further into your trip, did you become more comfortable and confident going into new and foreign countries?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, of course. Like, I think that's going to happen with anybody that's like cycling through like multiple countries. Is that as time goes on, you do get more confident with going into a new country and I guess picking up a new language. But then also, it's kind of like, you spent so much time in one country learning their language, and then you've got to start all over again. I was in Turkey for 6.5 weeks, and Turkish is really easy to pick up, and that's like the one language that I think that I did like I kind of picked up the best. And I remember leaving Turkey and going to Georgia, and it was like completely different, and it was like Georgian alphabet or something, and I was like, "What the hell is going on here?"
Yeah, I'm just even trying to think, is it like Cyrillic or something? I'm not sure. The alphabet's foreign, so you can't even read it.
Yeah, it's like going to China or something like that.
And that would only become more and more present as you kept moving along into different countries as well.
Yeah, exactly. But then you go into, I can't even remember now, it's there's so much that's happened, but I feel like you go into Central Asia and the alphabet goes back to being like an English alphabet, so you can kind of make out words and stuff. I think you do pick up stuff just whilst you're cycling, like just from road signs and stuff like that. I mean, the longer you spend in the country, the easier it is to pick up the language, I think. But yeah, I didn't find language barriers difficult at all.
That's encouraging. It's also a sign of the times, isn't it? How much more accessible this has become in a way. Things that would potentially have been more of a struggle now aren't necessarily the case.
Exactly. It's like I speak to cyclists or travelers who are like 70 years old now. And so they did all of this traveling when they were like in the 70s or 80s, when they didn't have a phone, they didn't have internet. And for me, I think that's inspiring. I think that's like more of an authentic way of traveling than what I'm doing now, because they literally didn't have anything. They didn't have any information. They just would use like a physical map. Like they would buy all of the maps that they needed for the regions that they were going to, and then they would sit there and just like draw out a route and then follow that route on a physical map. Whereas now we have like Google Maps, Maps.me, Commute, Strava.
Right, with GPS.
Yeah, do you know what I mean?
Devices on our bike that tell us when to go left, right, or straight on.
Exactly, and you can like zoom in or out of places on your phone. You can see like where the nearest shop is. Where if you're in like a rural area, you have some apps which tell you where you can get local drinking water. You have like apps like iOverlander which tell you where you can wild camp or where other people have wild camped or have stayed, and they review the wild camp places. So like there's not as much unknown as there was before 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Yeah, you can look at it as, yeah, this type of travel is really accessible now, or you can look at it as how easy it is compared to how it was before.
I guess here's a question for you then, Ed. Having had this experience, and I'm not saying by any means you need to start thinking of another one, because this is pretty mega, but having travelled in the way that you have, do you think there'd be part of you that would want to try and strip it back and go back hardcore to how people toured back in the 60s and 70s and go a bit more of the unknown? Not be as planned?
Yeah, maybe. I think, yeah, I would definitely be interested in stripping it back, I think. Because, yeah, there's a lot of, like on the trip, there hasn't been anything which is physically and mentally in terms of cycling. Yes, it has pushed me out of my comfort zone. But in terms of like navigation, unknown, feeling unsafe, not knowing where I'm going or not having a route planned or whatever, yeah, I haven't had that. So yeah, I mean that would push me out of my comfort zone, and everybody I imagine out of their comfort zone. I think not having any technology or internet, and it's just, do you know what I mean? It's authentic.
It's that safety net, isn't it? It's like the safety net's gone.
Yeah.
But there is that sort of thing. I've had a couple of guests now, and with minimum planning, maximum adventure, or my plan is to have no plan. And actually, one of my guests, Dr. Florence Cattell, she undertook an adventure from Quito in Ecuador all the way down to Ushuaia in Argentina, and decided very early on with the person that she was traveling with that they would have no electronic devices whatsoever. No phones, no GPS, nothing. They had a camera and had some interesting times getting lost in the desert there.
Wow.
So, I mean, that's maximum adventure, really, isn't it? And
That's awesome.
personally, I feel like I need something in the middle, maybe, but there is also that yearning for maybe...
Like, just strip it back. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like this other cyclist that I met, he met a like 70-year-old man, and he'd been cycling around the world for years, and he literally just had a map, like a physical map, and that's how he traveled. Like, he hasn't changed his style of traveling at all. He just uses a physical map, and that's good for him. And I just look at that and I think that's inspiring. I'm like, that's awesome. It's so simple, but he still manages to get around and still manages to get from A to B, which is great.
It might be inadvertently putting thoughts in your head here, man.
Yeah.
Next challenge, going the other way without a clue.
Yeah, exactly. We will see.
Hi everyone, it's Bella here from the show. Just a quick little break in the interview here to request a special favour. If you like what you've been listening to and you're a fan of the show, please go into your podcast player app now and give me a rating and a review. Really appreciate it. Okay, now back to the show. You had, throughout your trip here, Ed, you've undertaken lots of this trip on your own, but you've also had other people that you have cycled with you periodically on and off through the trip too, haven't you?
Yeah, so I mean, you say I've cycled it on my own. I would probably say I've cycled with people and done a little bit on my own. So yeah, I've been very lucky. I've had friends from home who are keen cyclists. So I've had a couple of them fly out with me and cycle with me. And then I've also met a lot of other bicycle tourers on the way and have cycled with them, which has been really, really good. I mean, those have been the best parts of the trip, to be honest, cycling with other cyclists. Yeah. Because there's a lot of people I've met and they've been like, oh, yeah, I haven't met a single person in 6 weeks. I'm like, how? How have you not met a single person in 6 weeks? I seem to meet people all the time. But then I am on Instagram, I am on WhatsApp, and there's a big community of cyclists on, like, there's different WhatsApp groups for cycling. So yeah, and you just like send people a message, oh, what are you doing? Where you at? Do you want to cycle from here to here? And yeah, most of the time that kind of rings true. So yeah, I meet up with these people and we cycle together.
What an experience to be able to share with others.
Yeah.
Because having the benefit of experiencing both parts of this trip with others and parts on your own, would you say your preference is with other people then?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, there's benefits. Yeah, there's benefits to both. I mean, I have just cycled the longest section on my own. So I'll probably be on my own for about a month or a month and a half. So yeah, and that's the longest time I've been on my own. So I guess, like, yeah, cycling with people, you get like, if there's a problem or an issue, all those problems are halved. Or if you're having a bad day, you can laugh about it with somebody else. Or you have like more brains to bounce around ideas, bounce around routes. So like, if you can't find anywhere to camp, then you have, like, I don't know, one or two other people looking for places to camp or coming up with ideas of where we can camp. Whereas when you're on your own, all of that is on you. So like, if there's a problem, you've got to come up with the solution yourself. You've got to find out where to camp. You've got to find food, find water, all this kind of thing. And if you're having a bad day, then, well, for me anyway, I just, like, mentally, I'll just go round in circles and circles and circles about why I'm having a bad day, what the issues are, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, I think there are definitely benefits to both. And I think maybe, yeah, I get more enjoyment overall out of cycling with other people. But then, yeah, having said that, like, when you cycle with other people, you have to get up at the same time as them. You have to be quite quick to put away the tent because you don't want to be the last person holding it up the group. I go to the toilet quite a lot, and when I cycle with other people, I'm always like wary about the fact that I need to stop to go to the toilet, and then I'm holding up the group. Whereas when you're on your own, you don't think about that. You're like, I can just go to the toilet whenever I want, or I can get up whenever I want, or I can, if I want to put away the tent slowly, I can do that.
There is that sort of feeling of, and whether it's internal pressure or external pressure, regardless, there's that sort of timed pressure that in a group dynamic that doesn't exist when you're on your own either.
Yeah, exactly.
So I can totally appreciate that. We talked about earlier when you were talking about your route and the highlights and what you wanted to definitely include. And you were talking about, I think it was the Pamir Highway.
Yeah. I love, like, the Pamir Highway. I don't know if this is true or whether it's just something that I've made up or something, but in my head it's like the world's best cycling route. I don't know whether I read that somewhere or whatever, but in my mind I'm like, this is like the world's best cycling route. I have to do it. And so the Pamir Highway goes from Dushanbe in Tajikistan, so the capital city of Tajikistan, and then it goes all the way up through the Pamir Mountains, like into Kyrgyzstan. And then from Kyrgyzstan, it kind of follows, I think it goes down to Osh and then maybe to Bishkek. I don't know. But yeah, so I was like, I want to do the Pamir Highway. And then from the Pamir Highway, I want to go into Kyrgyzstan and then quickly dip into China. And then from China, I wanted to take the Karakoram Highway into Pakistan. But yeah, the Pamir Highway was definitely one of the highlights of the trip. It's a pretty incredible place. It's like, at that point, it was like, I think the remotest place I've had ever been. And it's just wild. Yeah.
When you say, like, in your planning and you had it in your mind, the best bicycle touring route in the world or place to cycle ever in the road, what's it like when you get there then? Like it or not, you've got this preconceived thought in your mind of what it's going to be like. Did it meet up to those expectations?
Yeah. It's definitely something that you romanticize after the trip, like after you've done it. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, definitely. Type 2 fun.
Yeah, I mean, there were days when it was, so it took us 16 days to go from Dushanbe to Karakol. And there were 3 days where I was like, this is unbelievable. Like, this is why I'm here. This is why I'm doing the trip. Because you're just on the Pamir Highway, there's a part where it kind of like opens up and there's like 6,000 plus meter peaks all over the road, like surrounding the road. And you're about like 3,000 meters up and you're just like, this is incredible. Being surrounded by all of these mountains and the wilderness and the beauty of all of that kind of stuff. And you're like, yeah, this is why I'm doing the trip. But all the days in between were, yeah, some of them were quite tough. But it's because, so I was cycling with a girl called Harriet, another cyclist who I'd met in Cappadocia, I think. So we both basically got food poisoning quite early on, and it was like very bad food poisoning. And it wasn't a nice experience. There was lots of going to the toilet, like diarrhea and stuff on the side of the road. We didn't eat for about 3 days. After that, we were always playing catch up in terms of like eating and trying to get enough food in us. And we didn't, from then onwards, we didn't really eat in any of the homestays or the at restaurants or anything. We just tried to cook ourselves, but that kind of meant that we could only eat bread and like dry pasta or instant noodles or whatever. So yeah, I mean, for me, I lost like a lot of weight doing the Pamir Highway, and by the end, I was still having diarrhea by the last day, and I was like on Imodium, had no energy whatsoever. So by the last day, I was ready to go back to Dushanbe.
You were ready for it to be
Yeah,
over.
but it's literally just because I wasn't getting enough calories. I wasn't eating enough calories to have enough energy to do what we were doing every day. But I mean, it was an incredible experience. And it was like, it definitely pushed me out of my comfort zone, like mentally, I think. Because it was like, how do you keep going when you don't have any energy and you're sleep deprived?
And you're in a very remote area. You'd be very, very high altitude in many of those places too.
Yeah, so the highest we cycled to was 4,600 meters. So yeah, it is pretty high.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's almost twice the height of the highest point I've ever been to.
Oh, really?
It's mind-blowing, isn't
Yeah.
it? Just trying to think about that when you're cycling the highest peak in the Peak District in the UK.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
It just dwarfs them,
Yeah,
doesn't
yeah,
it?
yeah.
And you've done it here with your trusty Trek
Yeah.
carbon fork aluminium frame.
By this point, I had 32 mils, so tyres, so it was okay. On the Pamir Highway, I think I got about 13 punctures.
Oh my
If
goodness.
anyone's going to do the Pamir Highway, I wouldn't recommend doing it on 32s, but you can do it. I've done it.
You can. It just forces you to take extra breaks, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Just expect to get loads of punctures.
Actually, punctures is one thing, but reading up on your blog, Ed, you had some significant issues with your actual rims and wheels too, didn't you?
Yeah, so quite early on in Europe, I got quite a few broken spokes, and then I would get them fixed, but I'd like ride between like bike shops or like wherever I was when the spokes break. So, I mean, the longer you leave a broken spoke, I think the worse the wheel can get. Yeah, so basically, I got loads of broken spokes on my back wheel, and then the rim started to crack. And I rode on that for ages, and I was just like, "Oh, the rim's cracked. I should probably get a new rim." And then I spoke to a few people about it, and they're like, "Ed, you really need to sort out your back wheel. Like, maybe you should just get a new wheel." And then so I looked into it, and I was like, "Oh yeah, that's probably a good idea." And I was recommended this company in the UK that can make like custom wheels for bike touring, and they're supposed to be bulletproof. So I was like, yeah, maybe I'll just invest in a new wheel and get it shipped over to Turkey. So because I was doing the back one, I was like, I'll do the front one. I had friends visiting in Turkey, so I got them to bring the new wheels over. So basically, I got 2 new wheels, and then when I was in Kazakhstan, my back wheel was maybe, I don't know, a month old, a month and a half old. I'd spent quite a lot of money on this wheel, and we're in Kazakhstan, day 3 in the desert, and I cycled across like a railway track. And by the railway track was like a rubber. There was like rubber that would go over the railway track to protect cars from the railway track. But there was like a little inlet in between. And so I was like cycling across the railway track. And as I did that, like a gust of wind came, basically blew me and the bike into like the inlet, like the hole in between the rubber. And because that happened and the wind was so fast, the whole bike just fell on the ground. The wheel was in the hole. Yeah, so the bike like fell over. I fell over, picked up the bike, tried to move the bike like onto the side of the road, and I couldn't move the bike. And I was like, "Oh, why is the bike not moving?" And then I looked down at the wheel, and the whole wheel had folded in half. And
Tacoed. Oh my gosh.
I was like, "Geez, man, like what do I do?" in this situation. I can't continue to cycle. Like, there's no way I can continue to cycle. I'm in the middle of the desert in Kazakhstan. What do I do? So at that point in time, I was with a group of people. There was a group of 5 of us. So there were some people that were ahead, and there was one guy that was behind, and he caught up with me. And then there was a metal pole right next to the railway track, and so we got the wheel and we started banging the wheel back into shape against the metal pole.
This lovely expensive wheel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we eventually like put it back onto the bike. I tried to cycle with it, but it just like everything was gone. Like, and we basically decided that if I continued to cycle, then it would cause like more issues with the rest of the bike. And like we were going further into the desert. Like if anything else was to happen over the next couple of days, then I would be like absolutely stuck. Whereas where I was now, I was like maybe 6 miles away from a town. So basically, we just walked and kind of rode the bike back to the town. I was like pretty upset about the whole thing because I just spent so much money on this beautiful new wheel, and also I was in the desert and had no idea what to do. But anyway, so we got back to this town and went and stayed in this guest house. And I noticed there was a local guy staying in the guest house, and he had car keys in his hand. So I just got out Google Translate and was like, "Hey, I don't suppose you know anyone driving to Aktau?" So Aktau is the city which is about 200 kilometers away from where we were, and it's like the city on the Caspian Sea, and it's the city that we flew into. And so I was like, "Hey, I don't suppose you know anyone's driving to Aktau over the next couple of days?" And he replied, he was like, "Yeah, me. I'm driving there tomorrow." And I was like, "Oh, brilliant. I don't suppose you can drive me and my bike back to the Aktau so I can get a new wheel?" And he was like, "Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, of course. Oh, this is amazing. I've got a lift back to the city. I can go to like the 1 or 2 bike shops that are in the city and see if they've got a new wheel." And yeah, there was one 700C rim in this shop, so I bought it straight away. I just used it as like a temporary wheel just to get me back on the road. And yeah, and then the guy drove me back from Aktau back to the town that I was in before, so it was all perfect. It all worked out.
Problem solved. The universe sent an answer to. It was just fate. You're meant to meet the guy, and away you go again.
I thought he was going to that town just for business or work or something. I thought he was already going to that town, like driving there. But it turns out he just did it just because he saw that I needed help. Yeah, so very kind.
Kindness of strangers.
Yeah.
It's something, actually, Ed, and been fortunate to interview a few people that have crossed a lot of different countries on a bicycle tour now. But the resounding theme that keeps coming across is just the kindness of the strangers, of the people that you meet along the way.
100%. Like that's like the biggest thing I think that is I'm going to take away from this trip is the kindness of strangers. It's like you just wouldn't expect it from, like, especially coming from like a Western society where I think people are quite like individualistic and it's all like capitalist and stuff like that. So I guess it's not normal for you to help a stranger. I don't know. I've never experienced that before, but on this trip, it's just like constant, absolutely constant. It's like I'm trying to think of examples. Like where were we? We were in Uzbekistan, and we just came across this really small town. We got talking to the woman that worked in the supermarket, and she was just like, "What you guys are doing is amazing." And we had like all of this food that we were going to buy, and we took it to the till, and she was like, "It's all on me. Don't worry about it. Like, you have all this food for free." And we were like, "This is a lot of money. It's a lot of food. Like, please, can you let us pay?" And she was like, "No, absolutely not." And then she was like, "Do you need somewhere to stay tonight? My brother-in-law has a house. Like, you can stay with him." And we were like, "Oh, that's amazing." So we went and stayed with her brother-in-law in like this like really nice house in this like random place in Uzbekistan, and he treated us to like this huge spread of food. It was like fish and bread and sweets and dessert and chicken and stuff like that, and it was just incredible. It's like there's no reason for them to do that. It's just like pure kindness, I guess, for them to host us for the night.
It's definitely like a level of hospitality that we're just not accustomed to. And I'm not saying, like, I grew up in Australia. Australia's a very friendly nation. Generally if people are in trouble and someone sees, they'll lend a hand, I'm sure. But I don't think to that level.
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine as a cycle tourist walking into a small supermarket in Australia and the person behind the till saying, "Oh, wow, what an adventure you're having. Here, all the food's on me."
Yeah.
And by the way, can I host you and make you a dinner?
Yeah, I know, it's crazy, isn't it? Yeah, that kind of stuff like happened all the time. Like even I'm just trying to think like when we're in Pakistan, Like in Pakistan, people were just like so surprised that there were tourists in their country and so happy to see tourists in their country. Yeah, people would just either buy us drinks, Coke or whatever, or dinner or lunch. And the whole reason would be, you're a guest in our country, we need to treat you, we need to look after you whilst you're here. The generosity is just amazing. Like I remember we were in this restaurant and we are having dinner, and there's this group of guys sat opposite us, and they just like quickly sparked up conversation, like, "Oh, how you doing? Where you from? Blah blah blah." And we're like, "Yeah, like we're from the UK, France, whatever." Like we're just cycling around. They're like, "Awesome." And then that was the conversation. And then they finished their dinner. They got up and they left the restaurant. And then maybe half an hour later, we did the same. But when it came around to paying, we were like, "Oh, can we get the bill?" And they're like, "Oh no, those guys that were sat opposite you, they've already paid for all of your food." And they didn't even say anything. They just left, and they didn't say that they were going to pay for our food or whatever. And that kind of thing happened all the time in Pakistan, and especially actually like Muslim, like Islamic countries, it would happen a lot. It's like very, very kind and yeah, generous. Like someone even brought me museum tickets.
What was the
I
museum?
think it was the fort in Lahore. And he was just, yeah, again, amazed that we're in his country, like very happy for us to be there. And we're a guest, so he wanted to treat us. So he brought us museum tickets, which I felt quite bad about, because in Pakistan, like the price for a local and the price for a foreigner, it's like 5 to 6 times more expensive. So he would have been hugely out of pocket for doing that, but he literally wouldn't accept any of our money. But yeah, it was very, very kind.
I imagine that having so many of those instances coming at you, it'd have to have quite a large impact on you. And I mean an impact on you not just at the time, but possibly going forward as well.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's something that was probably going to impact me more and change the way I do things, maybe when I'm home, or how I think about things when I'm home. But yeah, I think it's definitely had an impact, and especially like you briefly spoke about Australia, and you can't imagine that happening in Australia. And I didn't think that that would happen in Australia either. And like, I'd been told so many stories about how people in Australia, they hate cyclists and they're not going to be welcoming to you and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, so I'm in Adelaide now. So I cycled from Perth to Adelaide. So I've been here maybe 2.5 weeks. And like, I've just been genuinely blown away by the amount of support I've received from Australians. And like a lot of the time, I found it like quite touching, especially because it's been like, maybe we'll talk about it later, but like crossing the Nullarbor and the days afterwards have been very tough. And when somebody shows you a bit of generosity, a bit of kindness, or a bit of support, it's like you hold on to that. And so I think the support that I've received in Australia has been sometimes overwhelming, and then other times it's just been like amazing to see. Like some guy thought what I was doing was was incredible. Like he was blown away by my trip. He gave me $100, 100 Australian dollars, which I was just shocked, like absolutely shocked by. Like I was on the side of the road. I'd met this guy the night before. He was with his wife at a campsite, so I'd been chatting to them, and then they caught up with me the next day on the side of the road whilst I was having some shade. And yeah, he like shook my hand and was like, "Ed, you're awesome." And like in his hand, he had hidden $100. I'm assuming he didn't want his wife to know. I'm not sure, but yeah, he had given me $100, which was just unbelievable. And then another time, I was at a roadhouse and I basically camped out. So like along the Nullarbor, there's like roadhouses and petrol stations. Yeah, so I stayed outside a roadhouse just because I needed to pitch my tent behind building because the wind was so strong. So I wanted to protect the tent and stuff from the wind. And so, yeah, I went into the bar just to have a Coke and to write my diary. And I took in my saucepan that I use to cook, and I put two unopened packets of instant noodles in there. And I was just going to ask them for boiling water, so I didn't have to get my stove out to cook the noodles. I sat there with my Pepsi first before I asked for boiling water, and just like wrote my diary. And then the guy sat behind me, this guy called Nathan. He like saw the instant noodles and basically turned around and was like, "Hey, is that what you're eating for dinner?" And I was like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm just gonna have the noodles, and I've got a few snacks and stuff." And he was basically like, "I can't believe that's what you're gonna have for dinner. Where I'm in a position where I can afford to pay for a meal. Can I buy you a meal?" And I was like, "Oh, that is like unbelievably kind." meals at these places, like in the Nullarbor and stuff, they cost like $30. It's like really, really expensive. I was like, no, don't worry, like I'm all good, thank you, though. And he was like, look, me and my girlfriend were in a position where we can afford to do this, and we would really like to do it. If you want a meal, we will buy you a meal. And he said it a couple of times, and I was just like, you know what? Actually, I do really want a meal. I've only been eating instant noodles for like 7 days.
Yeah. You could be sponsored by Maggi Noodles.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, this guy ended up buying me dinner, and I was just like, that's amazing. And then there's been a few other smaller things that have happened along the way, like people, like every single caravaner that's passed me, like will wave or beep enthusiastically. There was this one woman that's yeah, and there's this one woman that slowed down and like pulled down her window. I was like, come on, you could do it, keep going, you're doing amazingly, blah blah blah. And like that was like she probably yelled like encouragement at me for about 30 seconds, but like those words have lasted like way longer than those 30 seconds, you know?
I imagine when the wind's whipping in your face on the Nullarbor and the heat waves hitting you as well, like it's those words of encouragement that, you know, when you're on a bit of a downer, you might remind yourself of, which lift the spirits to keep pushing forward.
Yeah, exactly. And they do. And I think obviously she doesn't know the impact that her words have had, but yeah, they do last like a really long time for sure. And then even like pulling into, because like along in the Nullarbor, there's like rest areas where you can camp. And so a lot of caravanners will camp in these rest areas that are free. And like I pulled in after doing a 100-mile day, I pulled into a rest area. I've been in headwind for like the last 2 hours, cycling at 8 miles an hour,
Brutal.
absolutely drained. Yeah, drained.
In the heat.
Yeah. I just sat on the bench for like 5 minutes, and this guy gets out of his caravan, comes over to me, starts asking me about the bike. Turns out he's from the UK, and he's like, "Mate, what you're doing is amazing. Do you want a Yorkshire tea?" Like a Yorkshire tea is like a very famous. It's like a British tea brand, yeah. And so I was just like, you know what? That's exactly what I want. I'd love a Yorkshire tea. So then he goes back to his caravan, comes out like 2 minutes later with a massive mug of Yorkshire tea. And I'm like, this is amazing. And then like 10 minutes later, this other guy comes out of his caravan, asks about the bike, and it's like, is there anything I can do for you? And I was like, you know what? Can you please boil my noodles for me? He's like, yeah, sure. And then he ends up giving me like bananas, ice cream. I don't know. It's just those two guys didn't have to do that. They didn't have to come out and talk to me. They didn't have to give me a mug of tea or ice cream or banana or give me a bit of boiling water, but they did, and that just made my day so much easier. Having a conversation with them was just so much better. It was a good way to end the day.
It's so uplifting. I have to say, the Australian in me is really proud.
I mean, I've got so many more examples of how Australians have helped, but yeah.
And throughout every country, no doubt, as well. I mean, gosh, we have skipped over so many countries. It's one of the challenges when I interview a guest who's gone such a vast distance, Ed. It's like, where do I focus on? Because there's a million and one stories we could hone in on, and we don't have the time to. But
Yeah.
I do want to talk a little bit more about Asia, though, quickly. I feel like we totally skipped across there. Obviously, a lot of your time in Asia was spent in India as well. How long were you in India
I
for?
think I was in India for 6 or 7 weeks. So yeah, a long period of time, but I mean, people spend a lot longer there. So I guess it was quite quick for India.
But as part of your trip, 6 weeks, it's a month and a half out of your year-long journey. So it's a significant amount of your time.
Yeah, I mean, the only other place I spent 6 weeks or longer is Turkey before that, and now Australia.
You've still got a way to go in Australia yet. India, it's a country that I personally look to as it's a country I feel like it's busy. I feel like it's in your face,
It's all
eclectic.
those things.
Yeah, how was your experience through
How
there?
was my experience through India? I found India very, very tough. It's just very, very populated, very polluted. There are people everywhere. It's not set up for cycling at all. It's not set up for camping. The culture and the way that people are is very different to what I've experienced before in other countries and my own culture. So I guess everything was quite like in your face, quite confronting and not very enjoyable. It's the only time I've thought about quitting. It's the only time I thought about getting a flight home on the whole trip.
Wow. What stopped you?
What stopped me? Well, the end goal, getting to New Zealand. I've told everybody about it, so I've got to get there, firstly. And also just knowing that like the hard times will always be over. As in if you just keep cycling, it will end at some point. So I was like, I just need to get to Kolkata and then it will end. And then when I get out of Kolkata, like it'll be fine. So
6.5 weeks in an extremely busy country, as you said, it just all felt in your face. There must have been some moments of like, wow. Were there? Was it 6.5 weeks of, oh my goodness? Or...
yeah, there was some golden moments. Amritsar at the beginning, like the Golden Temple, was very, very nice. It's like one of the holiest places in India and is the holiest place in Sikh religion. So that was amazing, and that was right at the beginning of my time in India, and that was a really good way to kick off that leg of the journey. Udaipur was very nice. They call that the Venice or the Switzerland of India, and I can understand why. It's like beautiful, beautiful, crystal clear lakes with kind of rolling hills in the background, like floating palaces in the hills, and loads of nice temples and cobbled streets and very, very old architecture and very quiet as well. There's hardly anybody there. So that was beautiful. That was very nice. Going to Bodh Gaya, it's like the capital or the home of Buddhism in India. It's where, like, yeah, Buddhism was kind of like founded in India. That was really nice. That was very calm. There's like loads of temples and it was very tranquil. Seeing Diwali, yeah, Diwali was amazing in Varanasi. So being in the holiest city for the holiest festival, next to the holiest river in India, was, yeah, it was pretty special. It was pretty nice to see, and it was great to see all of these like devotees kind of carry out their spirituality. They go down to the Ganges and wash in the Ganges, and then light candles and put them on the river. And there was a big lighting ceremony with loads of like flames and kind of like theatrical dance. And
so a country which I guess so busy, such a culture shock probably. Maybe that's the right or the wrong word to describe it for you there as well. But I guess some highlights in amongst the lowlights there too for the trip.
It probably was a bit of a culture shock, yeah. I think, like, I mean, Pakistan, like, I think as you go on these journeys, like, obviously the culture and the way of living and stuff changes slowly as you travel. So I think by the time I got to Pakistan, like, Pakistan and India are quite similar in some ways, in terms of, like, I guess, poverty and stuff. So yeah, by the time I got to India, I kind of, yeah, had seen a lot of stuff in Pakistan. But yeah, India is Pakistan on steroids. It's crazy.
I can only imagine. I've not been there, but I always envisage it to be somewhere it's just in my face and busy.
Yeah, I mean, you have people, because you're a Westerner or you're white or whatever, you have like people just see you as rich, like wrongly or rightly. And so, yeah, people just come up and like either ask you for money or trying to sell you something. Or like I don't know, if you're getting a taxi or a tuk-tuk or something, like if you get off a train and you're at a train station and obviously there's like a taxi rank there, like they see you come over to you, you have like 20 people around you trying to sell you a taxi. You know, it's all everything's extreme and in your face, and there's no concept of personal space whatsoever. And then so you have that, and like I guess normal travelers will experience all of that kind of stuff, and then you have like the stuff on a bike. So you're cycling through this country, and so you can't like relax when you're off the bike, and you can't relax when you're on the bike because the traffic is so bad, and you have people constantly asking you for selfies, and yeah, it's just stressful.
So I guess the benefit of our listeners then, India, I'm retracing from UK, all the way you've travelled through Europe, Turkey, through the Stans, Pakistan, India. I know you're in Australia now. How did you travel through Southeast Asia? What was your route through there?
So from Kolkata, because Myanmar was closed because there's civil war at the moment. So I flew from Kolkata to Chiang Mai because I wanted to get as close to Myanmar as possible so I could continue as much as my original route as possible. So I went from Chiang Mai in the north of Thailand and then cycled over to the north of Laos. And then from Laos, I got a 2-day slow boat along the Mekong River through to Luang Prabang, which is a city in Laos. And then I met 2 other cyclists, and then we cycled it like through the mountainous area of northern Laos into the north of Vietnam up to Sapa, which is like a mountain village in the north of Vietnam. And then from there we cycled down to Halong Bay, which is like quite a famous touristy place, over to Cat Ba, which is like an island with loads of different islands. And then from there I basically just followed the coast all the way down to just above Ho Chi Minh in the south in South Vietnam, and then crossed over into Cambodia. And then from Cambodia, I went to Phnom Penh, then Siem Reap, and then back into Thailand. And then from Thailand, I followed the east coast all the way down, and then until I got to Malaysia, and then I crossed to the west coast, and then entered Malaysia, followed the west coast all the way down to Singapore. So that was basically the route in a nutshell.
That's a trip all in and of it all itself, and your whole trip is like you could just break down sections of it. And I wonder, Ed, whether you're going to do this. Like you're very close to the end of this trip, and I wonder there's going to be a point in time when you're back in London and you're going to look at a world map. And you're going to be able to just trace your eyes all the way down and have a story to tell in not just in each country, but in each village, each town, each city. The experiences that
Yeah.
you've built, and just think there'll be a time where you see a cycle tourist and you'll be the curious one asking them about their bike and where they're going, and you'll potentially be the person buying their meal, shaking their hand.
I mean, I've already thought like, yeah, when I'm back in the UK, I need to take like extra bottles of water with me just in case I meet a cycle tourer on the road, so I can give them some water.
See, it's already started, hasn't it?
Yeah.
I feel we've spoken about Australia, but I do want to just touch on it a little bit more because it is such a big part of your trip as well. You're I guess, halfway, possibly more than halfway across the country now in Adelaide.
If you look at a map, it looks like I'm more than halfway.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
in my mind, I'm like, I'm more than halfway.
You've seen a couple of kangaroos. You've gone through a proper Australian heatwave, so you've had your induction into Australian summer, well and truly. We've spoken about the kindness of the people that you've met along the road there, but let's just quickly talk about the road there. You know, the crossing the Nullarbor Plain. Like, that's a big achievement in and of itself as well.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if I'm honest with you, I didn't even know what the Nullarbor was before 6 months ago.
Yeah,
It
right.
wasn't until I was cycling with Harriet, another cyclist in Central Asia, and she was like half Australian, half British, and she was like, "Oh my god, Ed, I can't believe you're cycling across the Nullarbor. That's insane." I'm like, "Oh, really? Like everyone does it." I'm like, people that cycle Australia, like everyone goes Perth to Sydney, everyone crosses this route.
No, they don't.
What's the big issue? What's the big thing? And she was like, "Ed, what you're doing is insane." And I'm like, "Ah, I'll be fine. Like I'm sure, like people have done it before. It'll be fine." And then it wasn't until I did more research about it that I realized just how difficult or challenging it could be. And especially doing it in summer, which is probably a bit stupid. I don't know.
You adapted, like you ended up having some very early starts in the morning to try and escape the worst of the heat there too, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, like across the Nullarbor, the heat wasn't that bad. So there was one day where it got to 45 degrees and it was cloudy. So it was hot. Don't get me wrong, it was hot, and I probably almost got a heat stroke, but it was manageable. And all the days before that, it was probably late 30s. And to be honest, since Greece, basically, I've been in 30 plus degrees. So that's like 11 months. So I'm pretty acclimatized to 30 degrees. The heat across the Nullarbor was fine. It was just the wind, like the wind was insane. I was in a headwind from Norseman to Ceduna, so that's like the, I guess, the Nullarbor section. It's like 1,200 kilometers, which is basically like the length of the UK.
It's Le Jog.
It's the jog, yeah. It's the length of the UK, and within that you've got like, I don't know, 8 petrol stations or roadhouses, and literally nothing else. So like hardly any water supplies or anything. So that took me 8 days to do, of which I had 7.5 days of like headwind, and we're talking like 20 kilometer to 40 kilometer headwind.
Absolutely brutal.
It's just brutal, yeah. And it's been like I was getting up early for the wind initially because at night time, like the wind is usually the least windy.
Yeah, it drops a bit.
Yeah, it picks up during the day. So I was getting up early just to try and beat the wind, essentially. But I was doing like 9 or 10 hours on the bike. I think around maybe 9.5 hours on the bike just to try and get the distance covered. But in that, I would be cycling 140 kilometers. So it's very, well, for me anyway,
And it's flattish too, right? It's not, you're not talking mountainous terrain.
it is flat. I mean, it's rolling. So like when you hear when you got a headwind and you're going up like a very small like 1 to 2% hill, it's not even a hill, but you feel that big time, and you're like, oh, Australia is so hilly, but it's not. It's just
It's just was really windy.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That part was tough because of the wind, and I had 2 nights where I didn't sleep because so one night I couldn't put the tent up at all. Like I tried to put the tent up, but the wind bent my tent poles. So then I eventually just slept on the ground, wrapped in my outer layer of my tent, or tried to sleep anyway. So yeah, and then I had another night where the wind was like doing all sorts with my tent whilst I was in it. So I didn't sleep that night either. So I was pretty sleep deprived as well whilst I was crossing the Nullarbor. But the real challenge I think started afterwards, if I'm honest. Like the Nullarbor was hard because of the wind. If you had a tailwind or no wind, it would probably be one of the best rides I've ever done. Just like the road surface and the scenery and stuff like that is beautiful.
But the real challenge happened after?
But the real challenge happened after, yeah. Just quickly though, on that, the road trains. I need to talk about the road trains.
We
The
do.
road trains are insane. Like
Can you describe them for our listeners, actually? I know what they are very well because I'm an Australian, but for those who aren't familiar.
So a road train is basically like a truck or a lorry, but like think of like a truck or a lorry back in Europe or home or wherever, and it's just like one vehicle. Whereas the road train is that times like 5 or 6. So you have like multiple huge trucks, I guess, or shipping containers, or whatever, all joined together, and they just bomb it along the Nullarbor, like usually from Perth to Sydney, I think. So like straight across the country, and they're going like 110, 120 kilometers an hour. And there's not much shoulder on the side of the road. So it has been known for cyclists to have been killed by road trains. But yeah, these things they're massive. The longest one I saw was 53 meters long.
Far
Yeah,
out.
it's like proper like Mad Max style, you know? Yeah, so they were so very, very long, and they go very fast, and they're very big, and like especially when you've got the wind. So like when I'm in a headwind, you can't hear them come behind you. So all of a sudden they'll just come up and it'll be like boom. So that's quite scary. And then also there's like I don't know, what would you call it, like the suction. So like when they go past, by the end, the air, or they kind of like suck you into the road.
You do. You feel the suck from it, absolutely. Which, when you're right near the trucks, is quite a
Yeah,
scary experience. It'd be all right if it wasn't so scary because you'd have some shelter from the wind. If you could just get that suction to like give you that draft, that'd be awesome.
yeah.
But yeah, you've got to keep your wits about you too. Oh, I can only imagine how many road trains you would have experienced there, Ed.
So I think I was doing, because there was flooding in the north of Australia, all of the road trains that would usually take that route, they were all going through the Nullarbor when I was there. So
So it was even
yeah,
busier.
so it was about 15 an hour, I think, if not more, which is
Wow.
just
Oh my
like,
gosh, that's
yeah, a
mental.
huge amount of road trains.
But you've made it to Adelaide
I've
now.
made it to Adelaide. Yes, the hardest part was crossing from Ceduna to Lucky Bay, or close to Adelaide, because of the heat wave. So there's a 5-day heat wave where it was 47 degrees a day.
I have experienced that temperature on a bike, and I think that's where you've got to start thinking about your health differently as well, because if heat stroke kicks in, it's a total different kettle of fish, as we would say. I'm glad you've survived that, and maybe your heat adaptation, cycling's perpetual summer since Greece, has helped from that perspective too. Which way are you going to be flying into New Zealand from? Are you heading towards Melbourne, or are you heading towards Sydney?
So I'm going to Sydney. So I'm going to fly Sydney to, I think I'm going to fly Sydney to Queenstown. I haven't decided yet.
Mega place to be.
Yeah, so
Queenstown Airport, actually, to fly into Queenstown Airport will be an experience in itself
oh
too. With
really?
the planes coming in over the lake. Oh yeah, I hope you have beautiful clear weather for that day. You deserve it. You deserve that scene from the
Thank you.
plane. Absolutely. And when you see it and it's a clear day, you'll say, "Bella from Seek Travel Ride podcast told me about this day." But I wish you perpetual tailwinds and beautiful, maybe semi-cloudy skies for shade,
Oh,
big shady
thank you.
trees, and just the most hospitable people for the rest of your trip, Ed. Quickly, can you just recap, what will the whole length of this trip be, roughly, in distance?
I think it's going to be around 25,000 kilometers.
Something that you thought about as when you were 17 or 18?
18, yeah.
And you're making it happen now, which is great. Look, I've got 2 quick questions. I have a feeling I definitely know the answer to the first one, but the second one will be interesting. So the first question is, if you had to choose to cycle up a constant hill or into a headwind, which one are you going to choose?
Constant hill, 100%.
Yeah, you feel like you've had a constant hill with a headwind in Australia, unfortunately.
Yeah. I was just going to say, with the hill, it's not mental battle, is it? It's because you can see the challenge, I guess, or the summit, yeah. Whereas with a wind, it's like you can't see the thing that's slowing you down. So it's just like a mental, yeah, real mental challenge.
Absolutely. And the last question, if you had the choice that you're going to cycle for 4 hours, would you rather spend 4 hours cycling on your own or 4 hours cycling with other people?
4 hours cycling with other people.
I had a hint that that might have been the case. Ed, it has been an absolute pleasure hearing your story. I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye on your progress. In fact, quickly, how can our listeners follow you and see this journey for themselves? How can they find you
Online, they can follow me on Instagram. So my handle is at ed_Hawes, so HAWES1. And I also have a website, cycleuk2nz.com, where I'm trying to write a blog and highlight some of the things that I've been doing. I'm not very up to date, so yeah.
It's one of those things. This is the time to be in the trip itself, and the blog updates will be happening in a future time.
Exactly.
I will provide links to both of those in our show notes for our listeners. Ed Hawes, thank you so much for sharing your story with us here today. I wish you a pleasant onward journey to your end destination.
Awesome. Thank you very much for having me. It's been great to chat about everything, so thank you.
I really, really enjoyed my chat there with Ed, and I hope you enjoyed listening back to that interview there. I can also give you an update on his trip. So I conducted this interview a few weeks ago while Ed was in Adelaide, and drumroll please, dun 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 dun, Ed has now finished his trip. He has successfully cycled all the way from his home there in London in the UK, all the way to the other side of the world, the Southern Hemisphere, to New Zealand. Congratulations, Ed. What an absolutely monumental achievement. In speaking with Ed back and forth since conducting this interview, he has also kindly agreed to sit down at a later date and update us on this trip and fill in the gaps, go a bit deeper into some of those countries we didn't even get to talk about, and also let us know how the end of his trip went. So watch this space and I'll be really keen to give you some more updates. Now, if you're really enjoying the show and loving the Seek Travel Ride podcast, make sure to follow the show on your podcast player so that you are updated as to when new episodes have been released. The show is truly global now. We are fast approaching 800 cities all around the world, not to mention all those small little towns and villages too. And we're sneaking up on 80 countries as well. It really blows my mind just the far-flung places that my podcast is reaching, and I am always so thrilled to get emails and messages from you all just letting me know how much you're enjoying these interviews. Of course, if you yourself have undertaken an adventure on a bike and would like to have your story shared all around the world, please get in touch. Send me an email. My email address is podcast@seektravelride.com. And just send me an email to request to be interviewed as a guest for the show. I'm sure I'd love to hear your story and share it with others. Until the next episode, my name's Bella Malloy. Thanks for listening.